This episode is brought to you by BoatTech.
Forward-facing sonar, sometimes simply called LiveScope, is the hottest technology in fishing right now, and it's also the most controversial. So much so that some folks simply want it banned from pro bass fishing. But at the same time, more and more fishing brands are introducing products specifically designed to be paired with FFS technology. I'm Editor-in-Chief Alex Robinson, and I catch most of my bass on frogs and Senko worms. In other words, I do not know much about FFS. So to help explain where this technology is going, today on the podcast we have OL's resident bass nerd, Derek Horner. He's a former college tournament angler, and he recently has been doing a lot of coverage for us around FFS. Here's what's going on in the fishing industry and how it might affect your local bass spots. All right, Derek, to set the stage for this conversation we're about to have on forward-facing sonar, just give us all some background on your collegiate tournament fishing days. I want to take us back to the good old days when you were competing. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the good old days. I may have skipped a couple classes back in the day just for fishing trips and tournaments and stuff, but yeah, I mean, when I got to college, I was fishing in high school at a local level. You know, the Bass Federation has like tons of tiny local tournaments. So I was fishing in those. And then when I got to college, I decided like, I really want to do this. And at the time, college fishing was like just kind of in the upswing. Like not that many people knew about it. A lot of schools weren't doing scholarships for it yet. Like it was still very much like a club level, even at the bigger colleges down south. So I reached out to Penn State Bass Fishing on Facebook, got a hold of, I think it was Reese Hudson at the time, said, I'm really interested in joining. What do I need to know? Where do I need to go? And freshman year, the involvement fair, I went and signed up. I very quickly realized that like I was way more into it than the vast majority of the people that were there at the time. So I took on a bunch of advanced roles, became the team captain that year, and then started like recruiting other people that went to Penn State main campus that I knew had boats, because that's kind of the big thing with college fishing. Once we got a pretty solid core group, my 4 years, we had like 9 or 10 boats in the club. We would travel all over the place. I would love to tell you I got permission from my professors to go do that all the time. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. But like, you know, sometimes we'd drive to Tennessee for a weekend and fish a college tournament down there and then drive the whole way back so we could be at class for an 8 a.m. on Monday. And what that led to is just like, I already had a passion for bass fishing, but like it really exploded. Like even in my free time at night, instead of watching like Netflix or videos and stuff, I was watching how-to videos from the pros. I was watching all the old Bassmaster videos from the, early 2000s, kind of 2010s. Just trying to figure out as much as I could from these pros and all of their tactics and techniques they were using with, at the time, like 2D sonar, side imaging, and then towards the end of my college career, like 360 came out. So like trying to just grasp as much of the technology advancements as I could with, the graph technology, the bait, rod, and reel market kept as well. So, I learned that the rods and reels that I was using in high school, which I stole, out of my barn, which dad used to fish with, weren't cutting it anymore. So I spent a lot of money on, brand new gear. We worked with some really cool companies, and just overall, like the entire college fishing experience opened the doors to understanding the fishing industry as a whole. And honestly, it's what opened the door to let me into the outdoors industry, was my love for fishing when I was in college.
Yeah. And you wanted to go pro, right? Your dream was like, I'm going to be a pro bass fisherman, but we don't have to get into the details of that because you did not. That's okay.
I did not.
The point is, though, that I'm interested in here for this story is you fished with a lot of the kids who are now in the pro circuit. Like you competed against them. You kind of saw them come up. You were coming up with them kind of using similar technology. So I think you have a pretty good insight into what we're going to talk about, which is forward-facing sonar.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of your young pros, if you want to call them that, but like I'll use Cody Huff as an example. Seemed like Cody and the Bethel team was at every college tournament that we went to during the week, during, the early weekends. So it's really been cool to see a guy like Cody Huff make the elites and do as well as he has so far. And there's a bunch of others. John Garrett, name another example. But yeah, I came up with those guys, different circumstances for sure, but it's been really cool to watch them, succeed at the highest level our sport has to offer.
Yeah. And how old are you now?
I am 28.
Okay, this is perfect because you're still like relatively young. And, with any sort of new technology, oftentimes it's the younger generations that are able to figure it out and really perfect its use. But also you kind of have like an old soul about you. You're not the kind of person who will gravitate toward technology just for technology's sake. So I think that also makes you kind of an interesting person to talk about forward-facing sonar. Plus, you're just a huge bass nerd. You're like, already kind of told the story, but you watch all the pro tournaments and follow the tours very closely. And let's kind of get into that part because what was it? About a year ago, at a certain point, there's this sort of uproar from the fans of pro bass fishing around forward-facing sonar. A lot of folks are kind of calling for it to be banned. So talk about that. Where is this coming from?
Sure. I am actually riding like the fine line between I understand the benefits of FFS, but I also wouldn't hate to see it gone either. And since I'm not a pro, I don't really have to, watch what I say there. I enjoy using it, but I also loved fishing before it existed. The biggest thing that people are shouting out, and it's kind of like a catch-22 here, is, they're saying it's really, really frustrating to watch pros just stare down at a graph all day, if you're watching it on live television or as close to live as it gets. 8 hours of a live stream of watching people with their head down fishing and making like a cast every couple minutes because they're not currently seeing the fish they want to cast to. It's boring. Even when forward-facing sonar wasn't around and it was just 2D down imaging, like they were doing the same thing. I think the difference now is the pros are so locked in on that screen that they're not turning around and talking to the camera and giving kind of those like on the water breakdowns that we used to get in the 2010s era. I wouldn't say that it's because they're always staring at their screen because they've always stared at the screens, but I think a lot of fans also really dislike it because they might not be able to afford it or they don't want to spend the money to do it. I mean, it's not exactly a cheap barrier. Like there's a huge barrier to entry to get forward-facing sonar gear. And if you want to be competitive in today's tournaments, like I might catch heat for this, but like you kind of have to have it. You can get lucky and go win without it. The vast majority of the time, you're going to need it to get, even if it's just 1 or 2 extra bites throughout the day, like you're going to need FFS in a tournament day to really help you get there, even in shallow water events. Like it's just going to help somebody catch an extra fish or two that's going to give them a competitive edge. So I think that it gets on the chopping block there with the bass fishing fans. 1, because it makes the live streams fairly tough to watch. And 2, it's expensive. And if you either can't afford it or don't want to spend the money on it, like it's a lot easier to say, I think it's boring to watch than I can't afford it.
Yeah.
That's just my own personal opinion.
Yeah. Versus like, well, to be fair, bass fishing's always been expensive, or at least maybe not always been expensive, but the illustration of professional bass fishing has always been expensive. But I think the other side of the coin is like, you can watch Kevin Van Dam throw a spinnerbait and you might not be able to afford the boat that he's in, but you can get a spinnerbait too, and you can use the same technique that he's using, where with this forward-facing sonar, some people may not be able to spend that on, fishing technology. So those folks are out. And now they're watching these pros kind of dominate these tournaments with the technology that they may never be able to afford. So I can see the frustration there from fans. But can you explain why, in your opinion, forward-facing sonar is not going to be banned? Like it's here to stay?
Yeah, I sure can. For anyone who's also a bass fishing nerd listening to this, I'm going to shout someone out, and I kind of hope he listens to this. A few weeks ago, a very controversial angler who runs his own podcast, Randy Blockett, came out saying that he had heard rumblings that they're really definitely going to figure out a way to ban it in the off season. Randy, you're dead wrong. There's no way that that's going to happen. Why? Is because bass fishing in and of itself, these pro tours, by endemic sponsorships. That's the only way pro fishing continues, is fishing companies sponsoring these Elite Series anglers and the Elite Series itself, or the Major League Fishing anglers and Major League Fishing itself. There's a couple non-endemics that get thrown in, like Toyota, for example, but I don't think that they're pushing enough money to keep the sports alive if those endemic companies were to, say, get angry and pull their advertising dollars. Bass fishing is a siloed sport at the professional level. We are stuck in our own industry. And as companies like a Shimano or a Rapala or a Berkeley come out with forward-facing sonar gear, and they're the ones that are putting in all of the advertising dollars to keep these tours alive, it really makes a lot of sense that they're not going to want those tours to ban forward-facing sonar at the professional level, because then the new gear that they're coming out with isn't going to get the airtime, and it's not going to be used by the pros at that point. So it's going to be a lot harder to sell that gear to people who aren't watching it being used. Or, if it's banned at the pro level, who's to say that it's not been banned at local levels? And then all of this forward-facing sonar gear is just for fun fishing, and it's just not going to sell as well. And whether we like it or not, we live in a capitalistic society, and bass fishing is not outside of that realm. So if the companies with all the money are making money from forward-facing sonar, and they decide if forward-facing sonar gets to stay on the pro tours, I don't think forward-facing sonar is going anywhere, and I don't think that that's much of a stretch.
Yeah. You're talking about not only the companies that create the FFS technology in the first place, like Humminbird and Garmin. You're talking about Berkeley. They're making changes. They're creating marketing plans around forward-facing sonar, as are many other manufacturers in the industry. And they're not going to want to see in 2025, oh, actually, nope, you can't use any of that stuff, or you can't use forward-facing sonar. So all the product that you created around that environment is not going to be shown. Because, you tell me, but it seems like the bass fishing world follows the pro fishing world, right? What we get as, the tactics and gear we use as average Joes, that all trickles down. That all comes from the pro world first. Is that true?
Oh, 100%. 100%. And yeah, in my argument, I left out Humminbird, Lowrance, and Garmin, the ones who are producing the forward-facing sonar units themselves, purely because, of course, they don't want it to go anywhere. They're making money hand over fist as people are selling, a car so they can afford it for their boat. They're trying everything they can to get it. So more so, yeah, it's just the industry as a whole is getting into making forward-facing sonar gear. But to answer your question about how the pro fishing their techniques trickle down to us, 100% that's true. An example I'll use is the Whopper Plopper. This was back in the early 2010s. Chris Lane won a tournament on the Whopper Plopper. No one had heard of this bait before other than a select few. And the next thing you knew, for 3 or 4 years after that, they were selling out at every tackle store that you could find it. Every single bass in every lake had seen a Whopper Plopper come across the top of the water. And frankly, they kind of stopped eating it after a while because they got used to seeing it. But for a couple of years there, it was the thing to do. And that was unlocked by, Chris Lane winning that tournament.
All right. I have to admit, I'm a little skeptical about the real performance of some of these forward-facing sonar specific lures, reels, rods. There's even Line. You wrote a story kind of rounding up all these new products that are, meant to be paired with forward-facing sonar. So would you talk about each of these products and what they do differently and how they're meant to be paired with FFS?
Yeah, and I totally get the skepticism. Frankly, when forward-facing sonar first came out and these rod, reel, bait manufacturers hadn't caught up yet, people were still catching fish using the good old techniques like a drop shot or a Ned rig, watching fish with forward-facing sonar. But now these companies are coming out with baits specific to forward-facing sonar that make it easier to fish and easier to catch those fish. So it's going to look very simple, but frankly, here's an example. It's a little tiny jig head with a small, call it 2.8 inch or 3 inch bait on the back of it. And this is what you throw nowadays when you see a fish on live sonar. And this bait is built specifically to look hyper realistic. So that's what a lot of these bait companies are coming out with for the FFS stuff is hyper realistic. And there was a ton of launches at ICAST this year, but hyper realism is going to make highly pressured fish that are getting targeted a lot more often more likely to bite. So, you can't really stray away from the look per se as far as like the jig head and the soft plastic bait, but you can make this soft plastic look as much like a bait fish as you can, especially as it suspends on that, and you're reeling it back to the boat. Like, what's this tail doing underwater? How's it going to, is it going to shimmy and shake? Is it going to dive? How do you want it to look? And based on what forward-facing sonar technique you're using, there's different baits to buy now. Are they better than, seeing them and throwing a drop shot at them? Maybe. But I think on the bait front, you have skepticism, because even I, having used these forward-facing sonar baits versus using the old school stuff, like I might catch a couple more fish on the forward-facing sonar baits, but I don't know if it's making that much of a difference. With that said, the rods and reels, and we'll get into the line, because the line is like a brand new thing. Berkeley really kind of, with the new forward braid, really kind of setting a new stage there that I think in the coming months you're going to see more companies follow. But the reels and rods, there's like really specific stuff that the guys who are good at forward-facing sonar fishing, whether it's strolling, moping, or hover strolling, like they have rods specifically that they love for that. So when it comes to the rod, like a lot of them say they want a longer rod with a super long but soft tip, and then it has to get like really heavy into the backbone. So like that tip has a lot of bend, but then like the main portion of the rod is like super stiff. The reason there is usually when those fish eat that bait, they're coming up behind it because they're chasing it, and you're kind of like watching them on the screen. You're pulling it away from them, almost like an ice fishing tactic where you keep your bait above them the whole time. Sure. So when they eat it, they're coming up at it, and that's going to put a lot of slack in the line. And you don't want to like big sweeping hook set because you'll probably break your light line. So you reel down to them, and that light tip is going to load up on that fish. So longer, light, like extra fast tip rods are what people are going for. So there are now companies that are building rods specific, for forward-facing sonar, saying that like this tip is the best tip for that loading action. When it comes to the reels, like we'll talk about the Revo Rocket from Abu Garcia. They're marketing this as a forward-facing sonar reel because it's one of the fastest spinning reels as far as gear ratio goes. I think it's a 7.6 to 1. But basically, like each rotation brings in so much line. So when they eat that bait coming up at it, you can catch up to them a lot faster and make sure you're getting a hook in them. And that's really important because obviously if you have slack in your line, you go to set that hook, you might not get the hook point where you want it, or they're going to, spit it out before you really get them hooked good. The other thing with reels, Shimano is kind of the head on this, but they're launching a new MGL series. This is their new Miravel reel. It's a start and stop gear system in here. So like basically as you're reeling, you can see there as I stop it, like auto stops. There's no drift. There's no continuation. So as you're kind of jigging that bait through the water column and watching it on forward-facing sonar, you're starting and stopping your reeling technique as you go to get that fish to really kind of chase and stop and chase and stop. And every time that bait stops, you're kind of hoping that fish keeps swimming and runs into it. So the reels technology, like there's definitely something to be said there. There's definitely something to be said about the rod technology. I'm with you on the baits though.
I have a question on the baits quick before we jump ahead to line.
Sure.
Is it usually always easy to see the bait on your screen, or are any of these companies doing stuff to make their lures or their baits easier to see as a way of just like, that added value to the angler? Is there anything like that going on?
There is some of that going on. Like the bigger the bait, the more it's going to appear on your screen. The nice thing about FFS is like those companies, Garmin, Lowrance, Humminbird, are always putting out new like updates to the units, which are helping you kind of dial in your gain. It's like, and it's technology, right? Like how often do you update your computer? It's the same thing. It's just on your boat. So that's helping like those, helping you dial in these smaller baits. Cause like, obviously like this is small. And if you can see 80 feet in one direction, like how is this popping up? But you'd be really surprised. I think it's the movement in your bait, but you can pick it up pretty easily. Some companies are making larger looking, like super realistic shad baits, and you like nose hook them and they fall like a flutter spoon almost. Like those are going to be a lot easier to pick up than this. But frankly, as long as you have your like gain and your settings figured out, you can pick it up pretty easily. Like I was throwing this 2 days ago in a night tournament and had no problem picking it up. And we had our range at like 85 feet. So I had no problem seeing it, but we also had our gain dialed in pretty well. So
yeah,
a lot of companies are sticking to that super small profile just because it seems to be what the fish want to eat right now. Now there is like, you can throw that like 3-inch range, you can get into that like 5-inch range. And then, like I said, the old school stuff, like there are guys who throw 10-inch Magnum spoons on live and are watching fish come up and bite it, which is really cool to watch.
Yeah, that's awesome. Tell me about the line. What's the story there?
All right. So now I haven't got my hands on it yet. Excited to, but from what I've been told, as this is like a brand new release, this line won't flatten. So like Braid has a tendency, just how it's made, to like it comes in a beautiful little spiral circle. It is braid. So if you don't know what that means, they literally take line and like braid it together. It's super high strength test, but it has a tendency like over time to lose its color and flatten. And once your braid starts to flatten out, it is more likely to backlash and it's more likely to break. It's just kind of like the nature of the game when it comes to fishing with braid. This new forward braid that Berkeley announced supposedly holds that circle shape and will not flatten out. They said that they use some like kind of proprietary materials to put this braid together. And what that's going to allow it to do, like instead of it flattening out, if it stays circular, if you look at like the guides on a reel, those are circles, you're going to have less friction than if it's flattened out braid as it goes through your guides. So over the lifetime of your braid, you're going to kind of retain that fresh spool castability. Because when you like freshly spool up a spool of braid and like tie on your fluoro leader, you can bomb that thing out there. But kind of as that braid gets worn and worked and your drag goes and rubs on stuff, like your castability kind of goes down until you put a new spool on. I'm really excited to see if this forward braid maintains that. And basically that'll be perfect for forward facing sonar stuff because it's all about castability. When you're fishing for these fish, a lot of people might want to think that like, oh, as I if I find a fish on the screen, it's not going to go anywhere. And you couldn't be more wrong.
Right.
The fish are usually, especially if you're going to catch them, chasing bait. They're swimming 2-3 miles an hour. Like there's a lot of chasing that goes on. So you're constantly casting and trying to get in front of these fish and reeling it back quickly. And like, you're going to go through some line if you're not using the right gear. So being able to kind of retain that castability is going to be a big thing.
Yeah. We'll get into the tactics here in a second, but with your description of kind of chasing them, it's just like, whatever can get you the farthest, most precise casts and sort of most precise retrieve too. It seems like that's what wins. Like you just have to have maximum control over your casting and presentation to do this stuff right.
100%. And I mean, realistically, it boils down to like, this is still like a hyper finesse tactic, especially if you compare it to like bass fishing tactics of old. This is super finesse stuff. So ultra light line, ultra light baits to be precise. Otherwise, especially as these fish get more and more pressured, they're just not going to eat.
We'll be right back after the break.
Having confidence in your gear is an absolute must in any season. And if you're a deer hunter, you know that some of the best opportunities come during bow season. Bowtech sets the gold standard in anywhere, anytime, tunability, and accuracy. Head over to bowtecharchery.com to see the full lineup.
Let's talk about tactics now. You mentioned 3, but let's talk about strolling first, because I know you're like, actually, your deadline's today. You're supposed to have this story in today. So you're writing this strolling story. What is this tactic all about? I keep hearing it from all of you bass nerds, but I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, and I know why you don't know what we're talking about, because frankly, I think that, and my story is almost complete, just to clear the air.
Okay, good.
It will be done by today. I don't think that there has ever been someone to come out and like really define these. Like different pros will mention different things, but like they're kind of all referring, like we've heard mid strolling. Well, like that's kind of like hover strolling in my opinion. We've also heard of Cindy rigging, which is kind of like moping. So like I'm going to come out and after talking with a bunch of, people who do this a ton and say there are 3 ways to do this, maybe 4, but we're going to stick with 3 and say it's strolling, moping, hover strolling.
Okay.
Now, let's define these. We'll start with strolling because that's the story I'm working on with my buddy Noah, who does this day in and day out. It's his job. He's a guide. So strolling is throwing something a little bit heavier, like call it like a 3/8 ounce jig head. Like I think this one's a quarter. It's right in the line of like between strolling and hover strolling. But basically, as you get into that like deep water scenario, say we're over 60 foot of water, there's a ball of alewives, and there's smallmouth chasing and eating those alewives up underneath the ball of bait. By strolling, you're going to cast out ball of bait 10 feet past it. And you can see all this on your screen, right? Your bait's going to drop down. Once you get like, call it 5 feet above where those smallmouth are feeding, you're going to engage your reel and really start like popping your rod tip and swimming that bait along. And basically what you're going to see on the screen is your bait going like this, kind of hovering through the water. Hence, strolling, hover strolling. As it strolls along, these smallmouth are going to see it, and you'll see them start to swim up to it and chase it. That's when it gets really exciting, because based on the mood of the fish, if they're like super actively feeding, sometimes you can go like super fast reeling and really make them chase it. Other times you got to stop, and that's where that like stop and start reel motion and having the right gear comes into play. But basically on the screen, you will see your bait, and the fish, when they finally eat it, you will usually watch them eat it before you feel the tick in your line. So strolling is stuff deeper water, kind of like lower in the water column. Hover strolling, we'll call it like the lighter little brother, would be if this was like a 1/32 ounce head or a 1/16 ounce head, and those fish are staged higher in the water column. Let's say those alewives are kind of like, it's late in the evening, they're up on the surface feeding. The smallmouth are maybe 10 foot under the surface. You can't throw this and control it because it's going to sink too quickly to really, keep it in that strike zone. So hover strolling is a lot lighter stuff. Maybe you're not even throwing on a jig head, like you're throwing like a nail weight in it, and it's just like a straight shank hook and some nail weights in this little soft plastic, like super lightweight stuff. But you still need to be able to cast it to those fish, and you're doing it the same thing, super slowly reeling it until they see it. They'll start to chase it, and then based on the mood of the fish, you decide, whether to go fast or slow. But that's higher in the water column would be hover strolling. And then moping is if you could take this, but usually you're going to use like a heavier head. Typically, I see moping deployed mostly in like the cold water scenarios where the fish are super lethargic. They're staged like just off the bottom. Like you'll look around and see the fish. Let's say we're fishing over 40 feet of water. They're staged in like 38 feet of water. Like they're 2 feet, 3 feet off the bottom, just like hanging out. There might be a ball of bait nearby, but they're usually not like actively hyper feeding like they are in the summer. Moping, you're going to cast out there, more vertical though. So like maybe like you're pitching it rather than casting it, and you're over top of these fish, kind of looking straight down on them. And your bait, your job on moping is to get your bait to kind of like sit in front of the fish.
Yeah.
And not really move it. Like you can pop the head a little bit, but like you want it to basically be, if I'm a fat kid who just finished a long day playing video games and I'm sitting in my chair and I'm hungry, but I don't feel like getting up, and all of a sudden someone's dangling a cheeseburger in front of my face.
Yeah.
Like at some point I'm going to eat the cheeseburger.
Right. If you leave it there long enough, but you're probably not going to sprint down the hallway to get it like the other feeding scenarios.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
And these are the tactics that you're seeing like the pros use and win with?
Yeah. So the Bassmaster Classic, not the one that we just had in March, but the one prior that Jeff Gustafson won on the Tennessee River, he was moping. He moped all of his fish, and he like smoked the entire field. Massacred the field. It wasn't even close. Hamner even used it this year when he won the Classic. We can look at like Trey McKinney's been doing strolling, hover strolling throughout the Bassmaster Elite Series this year. And prior to, an error he made in a recent tournament, was on track to win Rookie of the Year and Angler of the Year. And he still might, but he's been crushing it using these tactics. So all these younger anglers, even the guys who might be older but are willing to adapt, are crushing them with those 3 tactics.
Are you starting to, you mentioned the guide buddy that you have who's doing this every day, who's using strolling every day. Are you starting to see this in like your local tournaments too, and just serious but more everyday fishermen are utilizing this tactics as well?
Yeah. We call those guys the weekend warriors.
Yeah.
I guess technically that's where I would currently reside. Yeah, the weekend warriors are picking it up. And the guys who aren't doing it aren't competitive anymore. Like, it's just kind of become a fact of the game that, like, you have to have it, even at a local level. And there's been, like, local tournament groups that are like, we're going to, even if they don't ban it, we're going to say no forward-facing sonar. But I haven't come across a tournament where they've done that yet. So, yeah, even at the local level, I have some local guys here that a lot more often than I do, but they're still very much like, weekend warriors. They've been crushing bags this year, like locally in Pennsylvania, bags that are like unheard of, like 20 plus pound bags very consistently. And I think that it's just because they're fishing for, I'm going to call it like they've unlocked a new region of the lakes around here that in the summer, most people never used to fish.
Yeah. And that's a perfect segue into my line of thinking, because, if more and more weekend warriors are using these tactics, that's going to put, these presentations into this region of the lake that hadn't really been fished at all before. Go back maybe 5 years ago, no one's fishing out there now. And, fast forward a year or 2 years from now, all the weekend warriors are using these tactics in these areas. I mean, one, does this make these techniques perishable? Like, they're hot right now because this is the thing. It's kind of like new fish, new tactics. So that's my first question. And then two, does that kind of even out the playing field for forward-facing sonar? Like, if it becomes so prevalent and so popular that most people are doing it, do you think that we'll see it sort of flip where all of a sudden, hey, this guy, this you could win now by, flipping docks or something because everyone else is out chasing these fish offshore?
Yeah. I mean, first we'll address like the long-term effect of everyone using this. As more weekend warriors can afford it, I don't know if it's because it's more affordable or maybe they've just been like saving up for years, but yeah, I mean, more people are getting their hands on it. What that means on like the national scale we'll look at is, I mean, it's totally opinion based, but like, in my opinion, yeah, I think what's going to happen is the fish are going to get used to seeing these types of tactics. I've actually already seen, what I'll say is my opinion, fish that see these tactics and run away. Like 2 days ago, I said I was night fishing. We saw some fish that were, balled up under a school of bait. Our bait would come down, and whether we were using the wrong bait or the presentation wasn't right, like you could come up with a million excuses. Regardless, they saw my bait and swam away, like to the bottom, gone, see ya. They wanted
didn't
nothing
like
to
it.
do with it. Had those fish been caught recently? Maybe. Had those fish never seen it before and just something was off? Also maybe. But like times without forward-facing sonar did fish do that and we were unaware is the other side of that coin. Like maybe fish have always just run away from baits and we're just totally unaware of that until now. I think as more people use these tactics, we're going to see a change that will be healthy, in my opinion, at least. Like, maybe we won't see FFS dominate and, like, you have to have it to win. But I think it's always going to be that way, even if it was like, I was able to go flip up 5 good fish today, and then I went out deep and used forward-facing sonar to catch 2 or 3 giants to, like, round out the bag. I think those tactics and kind of like being well-rounded again is going to come back into play as more and more fish and more people use or see FFS. The other thing that's worth noting is like these big bodies of water, there are so many bass in there, and people just like, I don't think even me 10 years ago realized just how many fish are in Lake Champlain, for example. Like, it is a staggering number of bass that probably won't bite most days.
Yeah.
Like, they're just not in a feeding mood. And that's really hard to wrap your head around, even at a local level fishing, call it like a couple 1,000-acre lake. Like, there's a lot of fish in there that aren't going to eat that day. It doesn't mean that they're used to forward-facing sonar or they're used to seeing an Alabama rig, that they just weren't in a feeding mood that day. But I really do think there is something to the pressure of FFS. I think a lot more of it boils down to the actual pinging of the sonar than the baits themselves.
Explain that.
Next time you're out fishing with, even if it's 2D, down scan, jump in the water and swim under the boat. You can actually hear and feel the sonar, and it like pings. depending on what hertz it's at. Maybe it's at 720 hertz and it's ding, ding, ding. You can like feel it as a, when you're underwater. Those fish also can feel it, but because this is live, the hertz have to be so much quicker. So it's more of like a tap, 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 tap. And I think that as fish get caught consistently around that feeling or noise, I mean, they're going to feel it in their lateral line. That's how bass kind of live their lives, is through their lateral lines. They're going to get used to that sound and know that that sound means danger. I know someone on the OL team wrote a story about a study about how deer and elk and bear learned certain noises, and like human voice is super bad. I think bass can learn that like this sonar noise, whether they know it's sonar, but like this noise is super bad and dangerous.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Maybe I'm giving them too much credit, but
no, that makes a ton of sense. And I think I think there's studies out there around, I'm not sure if it was bass or muskies, but around motors, and that fish basically, hearing the vibrations from the motors and then either shutting down or going deep or kind of getting away from that perceived danger, and how, the more pressure they experienced, the more they kind of fled from the vibration of people in a boat making vibrations on the water. They sensed that meant danger. So that makes total sense. Then it will just be up to the FFS makers to like market stealth sonar. They'll have to figure out some marketing material about how our sonar is indetectable by the fish.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know what the future holds for all that. But I can totally see that being one of the next things, is like our sonar pings 50% less harder than the competition.
Yeah. To kind of bring it back where we started, the pro bass fishing world, which we already talked about, kind of leads the rest of the bass fishing community. Have there been any positives that you've seen, with the popularity and success of forward-facing sonar? Like, are there things that's changed about pro bass fishing that you're like, yeah, this is cool, I like this? There's some interesting new elements about pro fishing that there wasn't 5 or 10 years ago?
100%. And to bring it back to, like you mentioned, I'm still young enough to get the new technology, but I'm kind of an old soul. So like I mentioned, I'm not the biggest fan of watching guys do this, but on the flip side, being able to watch them do it has unlocked some really, really crazy stuff as a bass fan. Watching, the young crop of anglers come up and like dominate, like become household names overnight. And it's not just one of them. Like there's like 5, 6, 7, 8, a dozen of them that just like show up in the rookie season and are winning Elite Series tournaments against guys that have been household names for a decade. Like it's kind of given overnight success to a new crop of upcoming anglers, which is awesome to see as a fan. And the hopeful, maybe eventually go pro guy in me that still exists deep down is like, that'd be really cool. And it shows that it's possible and doable. The other piece of it is we're seeing giant bags of fish being caught. In the one story I recently wrote, I did a comparison on Lake Champlain where the elites are going to be headed next week. In 2019 or 2017, the average bag was like 18.5 or 19 pounds. And last year, and that's the winning bag, by the way, over the course of 3 days. Last year, the average winning bag was almost 22 pounds. Like there's a 3-pound gap per day. So like they're catching an extra 3 pounds a day over the course of 4 days or 3 days. Like it's unlocking just bigger fish. And we're seeing that tournament after tournament after tournament. I mean, there's been so many new record fish caught in the past couple of years that I'm kind of becoming dull to seeing it. Like, oh, another record bass got caught here, another record bass got caught there. Like, and I think it's just because so many people are catching fish that no one has fished for before up until now. So, as a fan of the sport and a bass, fanatic or nut or nerd, it's really cool to see bigger fish being caught and targeted. And like, I don't know, the tournament angler in me is just like, I want to figure out how everyone is doing it and find my own way of targeting specifically big fish so I can go out and win tournaments. Because in the end, if I didn't win tournaments, I wouldn't love tournament fishing. I'm a competitor at heart.
Yeah.
This is the new way to win.
Yeah. I mean, the appeal of pro bass fishing is like super fast boats, crazy cutting edge gear, and giant bass. It's like the same things we love about the Super Bowl, right? It's like spectacle, the biggest athletes, the fireworks. That's what we want to see in pro bass fishing. And at least on the giant bass side, forward-facing sonar is helping with that. So
it really is. Yeah. It's showing us some giant fish. And yeah, I mean, if you haven't seen it yet, if you're listening to this and you're not like a bass nerd and you haven't watched like day 3 of the Bassmaster Classic weigh-ins where, the Super 6 come in and they pull out, 2 5-pounders and the crowd goes wild. Like, that's what I dream of. Even at my local tournaments when I pull out 2 5-pounders. Like you said, it's the Super Bowl. And that's kind of what all of us dream of, at least as bass fishermen, is a giant crowd, the lights flashing, pulling 2 big giant bass out. And FFS has certainly given us more of that in the last couple of years.
Nice. Well, Derek, thanks for sharing all of this. I think I understand, old millennial me understands forward-facing sonar just a little bit better. And yeah, I look forward to seeing how these related products, these FFS specific lures and reels. I'm really interested how that plays out, in the next year to come.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited. It's always fun when change happens. A lot of people get really stubborn about it, but at this point, we all need to accept that forward-facing sonar is here to stay. So I'm excited to see what's along for the ride as far as new gear and new fish being caught.
The Outdoor Life podcast is edited by Mike Pedersen of 85 Audio. It's hosted by our editor-in-chief, Alex Robinson. And it's produced by me, executive editor Natalie Krebs. You can read Derek's full story at outdoorlife.com/FFS. That's outdoorlife.com/FFS. Music in this episode is composed and performed by Pierre Locatelli via APM Music.